Greetings, everyone. It's so good to be able to be with you, and I'm really glad that you have chosen to take this time to learn a bit more about Helen Keller, our great Swedenborgian saint. Many of you probably know me. I'm Sage Cole, the pastor and director of the Swedenborg Chapel in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I am the leader and the vision caster for what we are calling the Helen Keller Spiritual Life Center, a new center that we wish to create in Cambridge, dedicated to honoring and carrying forward the spiritual legacy of Helen Keller, perhaps the Swedenborgian Church's greatest saint. Now, there's much to tell you about this project, and I hope many of you will be moved to support us and to be involved. But today, what I'd like to do is to tell you the story of this great woman, why I'm so inspired by her and so committed to carrying forward her spiritual legacy. And I'd like to tell you her story from perhaps a slightly different perspective than you have heard it told before. Certainly a different perspective than most of the world knows about Helen Keller, from the perspective of her Swedenborgian faith. What I'd like to propose is that her faith played a much larger role in the twists and turns of Helen Keller's life than many realize. Now, we're going to start at the beginning, but we're not going to dwell too much on the story of Helen as a deaf and blind child, because this story has been told and retold and is firmly embedded in our collective consciousness. William Gibson's Tony-winning play and later Oscar-winning film, The Miracle Worker, made sure of it. Even if you haven't seen either, you will likely know the story of Helen at the water pump. There's a bronze statue of Helen at the water pump in the rotunda of the Capitol building. That was a gift of the state of Alabama in 2009. For many people, Helen at the water pump is the height of her story, the height of what made her life meaningful and powerful for the world. It is a fantastic story, but what I'd like to propose is it is fantastic not because it is the climax of the story of Helen Keller, but because it is where her story begins. Helen's story at the water pump was made possible because of a woman named Annie Sullivan, who arrives in Tuscumbia, Alabama on March 3rd, 1887. And Helen would always celebrate, even into her very old age, that date, March 3rd, as her spiritual birthday. Many years later, in 1948, while traveling in Australia on a global tour, advocating for the needs of the blind, Helen still speaks about her teacher in this way. Once I dwelt in a region of shadows and fears. No one, not even my mother, could communicate with me, and I could not express myself. A double darkness lay upon the face of all things. Then a word dropped into my hand from the fingers of my teacher. A ray of light from her soul set me free, and I found myself. I found my fellow men and God. Now flashback to 1882, when Helen is 19 months old and suffers from what the doctors at the time called brain fever, leaving her both deaf and blind. It is unlikely that her devastated mother and father, Kate and Captain Arthur Keller, imagined that their daughter would one day head off on a global speaking tour. For the 4 or so years between Helen's loss of sight and hearing and Annie Sullivan's arrival, very little hope existed for Helen's future. As was very common at the time and sadly continues to be so, many felt Helen was a blight on the family's reputation. Her family members encouraged her, Kate Keller, to put her daughter away in an institution. And her double disability of being cut off from hearing and sight didn't allow her to properly learn to mimic and behave as others, making her unruly and disruptive. There are no surviving pictures of Helen before Annie's arrival. We can imagine she was not fit to be photographed. But we see her first picture, a delightful young girl, taken sometime after Helen's arrival. After Annie's arrival, when Helen's unruly nature was finally tempered and refined through Annie's tutelage. Now, Georgina Klieg, an assistant professor of English at Cal Berkeley, sought to rethink this early period of Helen's life in a book she published in 2006 through Gallaudet Press called Blind Rage. And I want to share a bit of her insights with all of you. Blind herself, Klieg's book is a series of letters that she writes to Helen expressing her frustration at the unreachable standard of success and positivity that Helen left for her and others. She talks about how people would say to her as a young girl, "Why can't you be a bit more like Helen Keller?" In Klieg's book, she looks into and tries to lift out and explore the intelligence and will that were present in Helen before Annie's arrival, in that period of time where others spoke of her as a wildling, an unruly, and unconscious child. Klieg proposes that Helen was not a blank nothingness waiting to be filled, but an active, creative child who understood as much of the world as she could through the senses at her disposal. Helen, in fact, had language during this time, rudimentary but effective signs that she created to express her needs and observations. She had over 60. She would mimic her father adjusting his spectacles as a sign for him. She would turn a crank and shiver for ice cream. And she would tie an imaginary bonnet around her chin, indicating her favorite aunt. Klieg criticizes the focus on civilizing the disabled body, characterizing the story of Helen for being told from the perspective of Annie, the miracle worker. Speaking to Helen in one of the letters in her book, she writes, "She, Annie, was the one who worked the miracle and triumphed over adversity. You were the adversity she overcame." I find a lot to explore here. Certainly, we hope and believe that we've made progress in our work to recognize the inherent worth of all people, regardless of their differences, their right to belong, that people with disabilities are not problems to be overcome, but people to be included. And the progress we've made is due in large part to Helen's life. But a dimension of this that must be recognized is part of what made Helen able to affect society was her own ability to walk among and with the abled mainstream. And she is criticized by some within the disability community because of this very fact. Helen's life and witness to the importance of supporting and including persons with disabilities almost wasn't so if she herself had not met such high standards of normalcy. In a letter to an important confidant of Anne Sullivan, a Mrs. Hopkins, Annie writes about her first meeting of Helen. "Her little face wore an eager expression, and I noticed that her body was well-formed and sturdy. For this I was most thankful. I did not mind the tumbled hair, the soiled pinafore, the shoes tied with white strings. All that could be remedied in time. But if she had been deformed, or had acquired any of those nervous habits that so often accompany blindness, and which make an assemblage of blind people such a pitiful sight, how much harder it would have been for me." Now remember, Annie had been blind herself, so she is speaking this criticism with herself included. But still, it stings, and would hardly be something spoken in correct society today. If Annie had found Helen to be deformed, it is quite likely that she would not have committed herself to her in the same way. And it is likely that the embrace and support she received from the larger world would not have come if she had not been beautiful, sturdy, strong, if she had not been so delightful, if she had not appeared so normal. In considering Helen's role in the larger movement for disability rights and inclusion, this fact cannot be discounted. Helen fits the norms of the day, and this enabled her to pass in the ableistic world that surrounded her. In addition, many of those who supported her rise into celebrity and opportunity dissuaded her from working too much within the disabled community, or moving in circles with other people with disabilities, lest she lose her status as one of a kind, the star, the token, the miracle. I certainly understand this strategy, and this choice likely did impact her rise and her influence. But I wonder at the cost. I wonder what deep friendships in communities with others who experienced the world as she did, she may have missed out on. During her time at Perkins, while she was in the process of considering what her life may hold, for a brief time she had hopes of starting a school for others who were deafblind as she was. She was invigorated by this idea, excited and joyful, but she was ultimately dissuaded. Her able-bodied friends that surrounded and supported and delighted in her, quote, wanted more for her life. All these questions aside, Helen's life forever changed after the arrival of Annie Sullivan, and Annie fully embraced her and devoted herself to her learning and flourishing in the world. Only a year after Annie first arrived in Tuscumbia, Annie suggests that they go to Boston so Helen can study at Perkins School for the Blind, where Annie herself had been trained. And thus begins Helen's larger life in the world, her fame, and while not complete, in many ways her separation from her family. From this point on, Annie and Helen will be forever joined as teacher and student, as companions in the world. Helen's celebrity precedes her arrival in Boston, as reports of her achievements had been circulated widely, both by Michael Anagnos, the director of the Perkins School, who had sent Annie to Tuscumbia, and also Alexander Graham Bell, who had connected Kate and Captain Keller to the Perkins School and was an advocate of teaching the deaf, having both a deaf mother and a deaf wife. His invention of the telephone was in fact initially construed as a tool to help the hard of hearing, and only later would discover its wider applications. Helen delighted in Boston, and Boston delighted in her. Men and women of prominence and esteem flocked to meet her, and many became long life supporters and patrons. She befriended Oliver Wendell Holmes, whose poetry she adored and memorized. Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, would become a very good friend to Helen, and along with Alexander Graham Bell, would help to support Helen's continued education, so that ultimately she would be able to attend and graduate from Radcliffe College, the first deaf-blind person in the world to do so. The great philosopher and psychologist William James sought to make Helen's acquaintance as well, and stopped by the Institute one afternoon with a young student by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. This early meeting between the two as a student and young child would lead to Helen being a public advocate for racial equality in her adulthood. Du Bois recounts his visit there. When I was studying philosophy at Harvard under William James, we made an excursion one day out to Roxbury. We stopped at the blind asylum and saw a young girl who was blind and deaf and dumb, and yet who by infinite pains and loving sympathy had been made to speak without words and to understand without sounds. She was Helen Keller. Perhaps because she was blind to color differences in this world, I became intensely interested in her, and all through my life I have followed her career. Finally, there came the thing which I somehow sensed would come. Helen Keller was in her own state, Alabama, being feted and made much of by her fellow citizens. And yet courageously and frankly she spoke out on the iniquity and foolishness of the color line. It cost her something to speak. They wanted her to retract. But she sat serene in the consciousness of the truth that she uttered. And so it was proven, as I knew it would be, that this woman who sits in darkness has a spiritual insight clearer than that of many wide-eyed people who stare uncomprehendingly at this prejudiced world. Helen's support of racial equality was one of the most controversial things she did in her lifetime, and all she did was send one letter to Du Bois, which he published in the NAACP's periodical, The Crisis, along with a $100 donation from Helen to his work. While the mores of our time are always at work in the areas where we see freedom to be possible, Helen was not limited by her Southern background or her proud Confederate father to see the truth and to speak it. Now let's continue our story. Helen comes to Boston, and she for all amounts stays, completing her education through her degree from Radcliffe at the age of 24. She learns so much during this time, is influenced by so many thinkers, by the movements of the time, meets so many famous personages. But it is an unassuming elderly gentleman that I want to turn to next. Mr. John Hitz. His portrait pictured here with his hallmark long white beard. And then here in the background, in an outdoor shot of Helen, Hitz and Alexander Graham Bell on a blustery day at the beach. John Hitz, an elderly Swiss gentleman, served as director of the Volta Bureau, Alexander Graham Bell's Institute for Research and Support of the Deaf. Helen meets John Hitz when she is 13 years old, and he quickly becomes a second father to both her and her teacher, Annie Sullivan. In her letters, Helen would address Hitz as my lieber Pflegevater, my dear foster father, and Mr. Hitz was a devout Swedenborgian. While their friendship did not begin as an evangelization, Helen could not help but be curious about her dear Mr. Hitz's beliefs, especially because in general she was curious about religion, about God, and her curious nature was never satisfied with simple answers. The twists and turns of Helen's religious upbringing are actually quite interesting. While her mother and father were Presbyterian, being unable to see or hear for the first years of her childhood, her parents made no attempts to give her any religious education. Annie Sullivan was then also not a religious person. She took issue with her own Catholic upbringing, and so she did not volunteer to bring any religion into teaching Helen. Though while she didn't volunteer it, she was, however, concerned, as religious instruction was an expected part of all children's upbringing at the time. But when Annie brought the question to her teacher at Perkins, Michael Anagnos, he suggested that they withhold any specific religious instruction from Helen as an experiment to see what might naturally emerge from Helen within in terms of religious knowledge or impulse. This strategy, however, did not last long. Religion is so embedded in language and culture that Helen inevitably began to ask questions about it. When she did, Annie brought her to meet the prominent and beloved minister and preacher of Trinity Church in Boston, Reverend Philip Brooks. Brooks was a preacher who emphasized the unfailing love of God, and he would introduce Helen to Christianity. The two formed a close bond, and Helen would delight Reverend Brooks by telling him she had always known about God, even before she had any words, and in her darkness and isolation, she knew she was not alone. Helen, however, had a lot of questions, especially in regards to the Bible and its many confusing stories. Reverend Brooks also passed away when Helen was 13, just around the same time that she met Mr. Hitz. We can only imagine that she posed some of her religious questions to her Pflegevater Hitz, and he, in turn, introduced her to Swedenborg. It is reported that Hitz spent part of each morning translating portions of Swedenborg's works into Braille for Helen. In letters and notes during these teen years, there are references to Helen laying in a hammock reading her Swedenborg. And when Helen turns 16, she formally declares herself committed to Swedenborg's teachings and to living a life according to them. This very same year, her father dies, and this likely added to her decision, as she found great comfort in Swedenborg's rich depictions of the afterlife. Although she would never formally become a member of any particular church body, Swedenborgianism would continue to be Helen's chosen faith until her death. Her books of Swedenborg and her Bible were physically at her bedside when she died. She also spoke quite a number of times at Swedenborgian gatherings, twice at our church's annual national conventions in both 1919 and 1928. And then, of course, many of you know that she wrote a book about her faith titled My Religion that was published in 1927, and also an introduction to a new translation of Emanuel Swedenborg's True Christian Religion in 1933. This quote comes from this introduction. Since I was 16 years old, I have been a strong believer in the doctrines given to the world by Emanuel Swedenborg. It was his mission to teach men to listen to the inward voice rather than to opinions and disputations. After many years of reverent study of the Bible, I gratefully wonder if I am not more indebted to Swedenborg for the faith that turns my darkness to light than I have yet realized. Swedenborg was a mystic, but unlike many mystics, he did not stop at describing his experiences as ineffable, but instead he meticulously recorded them. Helen writes of herself as having this mystic sense, and having Swedenborg's elaborate descriptions of the spiritual dimension of life at her fingertips were a natural complement. Another quote from Helen's My Religion. Swedenborg's message has meant so much to me. It has given color and reality and unity to my thought of the life to come. It has exalted my ideas of love, truth, and usefulness. It has been my strongest incitement to overcome limitations. I bury my fingers in this great river of light that is higher than all stars, deeper than the silence which unfolds me. It alone is great, while all else is small and fragmentary. Now, her Swedenborgian faith that would continue to be the foundation of her life until the day that she died plays a great role in the two primary legacies of Helen Keller's life. Her legacy of overcoming limitation, and then secondly, her legacy of being committed always to overcoming the limitations that bind others. For the earlier part of her life, she took mostly comfort and personal meaning from her faith. Comfort that one day she would see and hear when released into the joys of heaven and would be reunited with those she loved. Comfort in the knowledge that the spiritual realm was not closed to her in her disability, that she could connect with it, travel in it, and revel in it as well, if not better than any seeing or hearing person. Comfort in knowing that her life purpose is to grow and overcome, so that her disability was in no way limiting her humanity, but merely the path given her for her own process of regeneration and spiritual growth. This part of Helen's spirituality saw beauty everywhere, God in all things, and goodness abounding. This is the Helen who most of the world fell in love with, and it continues to be the Helen that inspires many to find peace and acceptance in their circumstances. Helen's faith, however, would deepen and expand as she enters into adulthood. She would begin to understand the importance of transformation, not just for the individual, but for society as a whole. In 1903, she writes an essay titled Optimism that explores and elaborates on the ability of the individual to transform their circumstances through optimism. She would later refer to this as a work of immaturity, as she began to see the great sorrows of circumstance that so many people face, that no degree of optimism can transform. Now, Helen would find comfort and strength in Swedenborg's vision of the new church. The new heaven and the new earth that he proclaimed were coming into being as people lived good lives by the best that they knew, as creeds and dogma no longer separated and set people at odds with one another, as one human family of connection and collaboration came to be. She began to see how privileged she herself was, how much her success and achievement were due in large part to the privilege of resources, support, and opportunity that she enjoyed. And as was mentioned earlier, she was also privileged by her physical beauty and strength. This shift in her perspective would begin a new chapter of Helen's remarkable life, a chapter of speeches and travel, of protest and advocacy, a chapter where she would begin to be dubbed by some a radical. Adopting Swedenborgianism had perhaps been her first radical move, and now this faith that had at first given her comfort and the ability to see the good in all circumstances, now called her to be a prophet, a fearless advocate for the good, which at the time meant facing head-on a whole host of controversial issues of the day. Helen once noted to a reporter, "I do not like the world as it is, so I am trying to make it a little more as I want it." While her spiritual eyes were attuned to beauty, love, and goodness, as she came to know more of the world, to visit city slums, to read threats of war and violence, Helen felt outrage and passion to work not just for slow incremental change, for personal making the best of it, but for an entirely new world. And she was open to revolution if necessary. Helen joined the Socialist Party of Massachusetts in 1909. As many others at the time, Helen saw socialism as the hope for this new world that she believed could come into being, and in fact was. Now, Helen's Swedenborgian faith was showing up, not proclaiming the possibility of individual peace and transformation, but the inevitability of universal transformation. Helen took the biblical vision from the book of Revelation of a new heaven and a new earth as central to a description of a new era of light, justice, and love that was coming to be in the world. Socialism was to be the means for bringing about this new era. In a speech from 1916, she writes, "Let us use every weapon that comes to our hands. This is a battle of right against wrong. There is no neutral ground. The cause of industrial democracy is the cause of all the people. It is the cause of peace and justice to all men. It is the cause of God. God is coming with war. It is not the star of peace, but the sound of the 7 trumpets that is leading us into a new age. God is coming with war to cast down the selfishness, the brutality, and the oppression of the strong ones of the earth. Truly, he has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword, and his truth is marching on." Helen Keller was not moderate in her political ideals, and her commitment to socialist ideals never wavered. During the McCarthy era and its terrifying witch hunts, on July 24, 1957, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the former IWW organizer, who is now a leader of the Communist Party, spent her 65th birthday in jail. And while she was unable to receive the letter because of the policies of the federal women's prison at Alderson, West Virginia, she was sent birthday greetings from her old comrade, Helen Keller. "Loving birthday greetings, dear Elizabeth Flynn. May the sense of serving mankind bring strength and peace into your brave heart." Helen was 77 years old. Now, while the term socialism was more popular in Helen's day, the term feminism, which was much less spoken of, if at all. But Helen was a central figure in the first wave feminism and its fight for the women's right to vote. From her essay, Why Men Need Women's Suffrage, Helen writes, "So since masculine chivalry has failed us, we must hustle a bit and see what we can do for ourselves and the men who need our suffrage. First of all, we must organize. We must make ourselves so aggressive a political factor that our natural protectors can no longer deny us a voice in directing and shaping the laws under which we must live. We shall not see the end of capitalism and the triumph of democracy until men and women work together in the solving of their political, social, and economic problems. I realize that the vote is only one of many weapons in our fight for the freedom of all. But every means is precious, and equipped with the vote, men and women together will hasten the day when the age-long dream of liberty, equality, and brotherhood shall be realized upon the earth." Helen believed in this world of equality, that a new world, a new earth, and a new heaven were possible, and she never ceased to fight for it. Along with her work for women's rights, for economic justice, for racial equality, much of Helen's life was spent advocating for the needs of the blind and the deaf, for the disabled community. She's a key figure in the history of disability rights in our country. Her advocacy work took her around the globe, and she became an ambassador of sorts for the United States, advocating for international cooperation and peace. She was among the first people from the United States to visit the site of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima in Japan, and she had a huge outpouring of support and love from the Japanese, helping to heal the wounds of war. Helen Keller truly was known around the globe and continues to be. Helen Keller faced trial and adversity, sorrow and isolation, and through all of her life continued to rely on her faith in God, turned to her Bible and her writings of Emanuel Swedenborg to be sustained and encouraged on the journey. Sustained and encouraged to not just proclaim the truth of a new heaven and a new earth, but to work for it, to live for it, to say things that were challenging and hard at the time, to advocate for justice and equality when that was not the norm of the day. And she never wavered in her commitment to do so. Perhaps the rest of us won't all join the Socialist Party or make the same decisions that Helen did. We may not see the world the same way, and in some ways we shouldn't, because it is 2020 and not 1920. But the world is still struggling with many of the same concerns. And I pray that Helen's spiritual legacy for the world and for us will be one that encourages us to rest so firmly on our trust in God that we will be willing to be bold in our faith and our commitment that love truly will win, and that our work for love is never in vain. I want to close my talk today with Helen's words, written in 1957, towards the end of her life, in an essay titled My Luminous Universe. She writes, "My confidence in the final triumph of idealism over materialism does not spring from closing my mental eyes to the suffering or the evil doing of humankind, but rather from a steadfast belief that goodwill climbs upward in human nature, while the meanness and hatred drop into their native nothingness, and life goes on with unabated vigor to its new earth and heaven. There are two ways to look at destiny, one from below and the other from above. In one view, we are being pushed by irresistible forces, obsessed by the fear that war, ignorance, poverty, and barbarism will never be abolished. But looking up to the clock of truth, I see that humankind has been civilized only a few minutes, and I rest in the assurance that out of the problems and tensions which disturb thinking minds and warm hearts, there shall break the morning star of universal peace." May you all be well, and I pray that you've learned something from this talk, that Helen Keller may become a hero to you as she is to me, and that we may all carry forward her bravery and faith into the world. Be well, friends.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. My name is Becky Greenwood, and I'm the editor of The Messenger. We've just watched Disability, Divinity, and the Divine Human, Helen Keller's Spiritual Legacy. And I'd like to welcome my friend, Reverend Sage Cole from the Swedenborg Chapel in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Welcome,
hey,
Sage. Thank you so much for taking the time to put this together. Really good to see you.
It's good to see you.
Yeah, I always enjoy our conversations. We have a few minutes to answer some of the questions that came through during your presentation, and we had several good comments. But first of all, yesterday was Helen Keller's birthday.
I know, she's 140 in the spiritual world today.
So happy birthday to Helen. We're thinking about her today. Mm-hmm. One of the comments that came through was really cool. Given her times, it's still sad that Helen has had a little part in decisions about her own life.
Yeah, that's a good observation, and I certainly make that point in terms of some of the things she wanted to do, she wasn't able to do. But definitely for her time, I would say she was one of the more self-determined individuals for her time, and then certainly with her disability. You know, the fact that she didn't have a husband gave her a different level of freedom. Her and Annie living independently was pretty unique at the time. And a lot of the decisions that she made after Annie died to travel the world on behalf of the American Foundation for the Blind, that was her call. I didn't talk about it in my lecture, but even their tour on vaudeville was partly because Helen loved it. She loved the energy of the vaudeville stage and the people behind the scenes. So certainly there were some limitations, as there are for all of us, and certainly more in her time, but she accomplished quite a bit, and I think a lot that she was very proud of, even with those limitations.
Yeah. So how do you think that she would speak out about Black Lives Matter?
I just get goosebumps when I think about what's happening right now in the world. You know, simultaneously, our work for the Helen Keller Center is on pause because of the coronavirus and everything that's going on. But the movement for Black Lives Matter and the energy that has risen to acknowledge the sin of racism and the work that needs to be done internally and as a community, I believe she's working. I believe she is a member of Black Lives Matter. I think from the spiritual realm, she is a part of this movement. She even said before she died that she thought she would be more useful in the spiritual world than she was on earth. So I have no doubt that she is a part of that movement. Her support for racial equality was one of the most controversial things she did in her life. And I know someone was asking about her views being accepted by her family, and was she different than them? And I mean, she was from the South. Her father had fought in the Confederacy, and when she spoke in support of the NAACP and the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, you know, her family was furious, and there was a huge uproar around that. They were trying to force her to send in a retraction. So I feel confident that she is very excited about the movement of Black Lives Matter, and would be and is, and she did that on her own. You know, that was something she's looked right through that problem. Even in her time, she knew that this was that all human beings were created equal, and there was no distinction. And she also, I think, she always had her eye on economic justice, which we're seeing as we learn more about racism and the way it has affected, you know, the way that it's grounded very much in our consumer culture and our desire to hold on to wealth, and white people's desire to hold on to wealth and have power. She saw that as an ill from the beginning. That was the big part of her work, was working for economic justice. So she would have seen and been supportive and excited of how we're talking about those things now, that there's not more poverty in the Black community because the Black community has anything inherently wrong with them. It's because of the legacy of slavery and ownership and resources. And these were all things that she saw as sin and evil, and she wanted to work for it, to overcome it, to make a better world.
Good. So Jane asks, I think we know who Jane S might be, says that, Sage, thank you so much for bringing Helen alive for us, and it makes me wonder, what do you think she would be saying to us as Swedenborgians today?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to have her come speak to our convention again. She spoke to us in 1919, right around the World War I, right at the end, and spoke a lot about the spiritual world and what all those soldiers who had just died were saying to us, and the way they were calling us to work for peace. And so in that speech, she really commended our tradition for its proclamation of the reality of the spiritual world, because that was a big thing that gave her comfort. And for a lot of the world after World War I, it was that there was a growing belief in a heaven, probably in large part because of so much loss of human life. And then in her second visit to convention, this was right after My Religion was published, and she shared how her friends were talking about her book and saying, what is this tradition and why don't we know anything about it? That it was the beginning of her really kind of realizing how unknown the Swedenborgian Church was. And that was the convention where she said that it was time for the new church to put on its beautiful garments and shake off the dust of aloofness. So she was really hoping that convention would kind of be more public and more proactive in sharing the message that was so salvific for her, so salvific for us. Today, I don't know. I think probably the message of getting out from our aloofness would continue. But again, the focus of that was not necessarily like publish more, advertisements for your churches. It was about social action. She wanted to see people in convention getting involved in the work for a better world, for causes for the poor. She wanted to see people in the new church, living that life of working for that new heaven and new earth that is coming to be. Sometimes we've had a difficult time really getting in there and saying, okay, what does that look like? And how can we be a part of this new heaven and new earth that we're told is coming to be in the world in an active way? And she certainly devoted her entire life to that effort. And so she's a good example, I think, of how to be an awesome Swedenborgian, to not only proclaim that God is doing this thing, but to live it. And I think one last point is a lot of, obviously a lot of churches are active in the world and are doing great things. I think we have an opportunity to do those great things kind of along with like a really deep theological declaration that about the new heaven and the new earth, about a new world, that God is doing this thing and we can be a part of it. And also our theology of how change happens, that change happens as we see evils and as we repent from them. It just creates a really great frame for understanding how change happens and lifting it up to not just a material thing, but a spiritual reality that God is trying to change this world, just like God is trying to change us. And when we see those evils and vet them out, we are part of the change. We're not backtracking or, when things look worse, it doesn't necessarily mean they are worse. It means we're seeing the truth for the first time.
Yeah. You just mentioned her book, My Religion, and one of the other books that I used when I was in the library, and people would come in. When you work at a library, people talk to you behind the desk and they ask you, where do you go to church? What do you do this? And then you bring up Swedenborg and they look at you like, what are you talking about? But I would always take them to Helen Keller's book as a start to an introduction to what it was. It was a really cool thing for me to be able to do.
Yeah.
And then another comment that just came through is, did Helen ever write specifically about how she experienced God as a girl prior to her reading of Swedenborg by Braille?
How she experienced God as a girl?
When she was a girl, when she was a younger girl, before she had read. Yeah.
I'm going to have to keep digging in my research for her to find any kind of exact quotes. There is the record of her early experiences of God comes primarily from her relationship with Reverend Philip Brooks, who was the very famous preacher and pastor of the Episcopal Trinity Church in Boston. And so that was where she was first exposed to religion. And she said to her, I think the primary statement she said was, I knew I was never alone. That her sense of God was a sense of connection and not feeling alone, even in her darkness and in her, in the quiet of her own mind, she always felt connected. And so that certainly led her to quickly receive Swedenborgian understanding of the spiritual world and of other angels being connected to us, because that was her felt experience as a child of not being alone. Yeah.
So we have just a couple minutes left. How are things going at the Helen Keller Spiritual Life Center?
Things continue. I'm the primary part-time staff person, so the coronavirus has hit our production hard as I've become full-time homeschooling parent to my 3- and 5-year-old. But everything was in a great place when the coronavirus hit. So in some ways, if we were going to have everything be put on pause, I'm glad it was put on pause at this moment, because we have our building plan set up, we have our vision, we have our initial fundraising, and we had a whole tour schedule that had to be canceled. But it's ready to be taken up again once things start to turn back to normal. So we're still heading on track to be continuing to work to bring this into being. It's just on a bit of a pause right now, but it's, and it's a pause on our production, but I really believe that the social movements that we're seeing are certainly going to influence how this
ultimately. Oh, absolutely.
So even if I'm not necessarily getting a whole lot of things done every day, I think God is still working with the project.
Absolutely. Renee wants to know, as you continue to develop the center, what is needed most and what will donations help you with?
Is needed most. Right now, I think prayer is needed most. I think prayer, excitement, spreading the word, thinking about Helen, telling your friends about Helen, sending ideas. The fundraising is vital, certainly. And right now that's, and also, but I think this fundraising is also vital because it shows, again, the spiritual support. I mean, to make this happen, we need millions and millions of dollars. So right. I don't expect every individual to be able to pull that together. But I think the more that our goodwill and our desire to see this come into being, the places where those millions of dollars are possible will start to come into being. So I think for all of us average convention members, just keep, get on, share anything that we ever share about the Helen Keller Center, get on the mailing list if you're not on the mailing list yet. And yeah, pray, because I think that we have a vision, but God is still forming it. And I think especially the way that Black Lives Matter is going to influence what kind of a place this can be is to be seen. And it will depend a lot on who shows up to be a part of the journey. But I think my ultimate hope for Helen Keller Spiritual Life Center is it is a place that is doing the work of bringing about a new heaven and a new earth. That it is like, that we're there and Helen's there and she's leading us, and that it's about her life and sharing the story of her life because of that. It's so inspiring, but not just to edify ourselves, to change us and to then be a part of the change. So just keep praying for us and signing up on lists and showing your support and see if God is maybe inspiring you to be a bigger player in this journey, because we still are going to need bodies and board members, and a lot of things are going to still need to come together. So maybe one of you is going to be a part of that.
Maybe you could post a link to the email list in the comments so that people can make sure that they're on your emailing list.
Sure.
And that would be great. That's about all we have time for. Thank you, Reverend Cole, for joining us. And everyone, please, you're invited to continue the conversation in the comments section. Coming up next is another mini course, Finding Church Beyond the Walls, Reimagining Church in the Time of COVID with Reverend Anna Woofenden at 3:00. See you guys then. Bye.